Imagine working 30 years for a dream, only to find yourself shivering in a humid hostel with exactly $340 to your name. I traded my life savings for a retirement plan with a pulse in the Philippines, convinced I'd found a second youth with a woman who whispered forever, until I realized she was actually just auditing my bank account and plotting her exit before my last check even cleared. If you want to ensure you never become the next sucker to lose everything in paradise, hit that subscribe button right now. What I'm about to reveal is the brutal truth that those shiny travel vlogs will never tell you. If my ruin can save even one man from making the same mistake, then telling this story was worth it. Please hit the like button if this opened your eyes, and subscribe to the channel to stay protected from the Disney filter traps that destroyed my life. Before the humidity of Southeast Asia became my reality, my world was painted in shades of corporate beige and fluorescent flicker. I spent 30 grueling years in a climate-controlled cubicle that felt more like a padded cell than an office, grinding away for a company that didn't even know my middle name. I was just a human-shaped gear in a machine that consumed my youth and spat out a paycheck just large enough to keep me coming back every Monday. My life was a sterile waiting room for death, a place where the air felt recycled, and the only excitement was a stale donut in the break room. Then came the divorce, which acted like a surgical strike on my remaining sanity and my bank account. After 20 years of marriage, I found myself standing in a 3-bedroom house that suddenly felt like a cavernous museum of failed expectations. My ex-wife had moved on, my children were busy with their own complicated lives, and I was left with the deafening sound of silence echoing off the walls. Every single evening, I would sit in my recliner, eating a lukewarm microwave dinner, while the blue light of the television illuminated my thinning hair, realizing I had become a ghost in my own home. In the world I came from, a man of my age becomes essentially invisible once the wedding ring comes off and the hair starts to gray. I would walk through the local grocery store or sit at a quiet bar, and the women my age looked right through me as if I were made of glass. There was no warmth, no spark, and certainly no hope for a fresh start in a culture that treats aging men like obsolete software. I felt like a discarded relic of a bygone era, a man with a full wallet but an entirely empty heart, drifting through a society that had no use for my presence. I became obsessed with my retirement fund, treating every dollar saved like a brick in a wall I was building to protect myself from a lonely future. I clipped coupons, drove a 10-year-old sedan, and avoided every possible luxury just so my golden parachute would be heavy enough to carry me far away from that gray existence. My life was defined by what I didn't spend and what I didn't do, a calculated sacrifice of the present for a theoretical someday that felt increasingly distant. I was a man who had mastered the art of survival, but had completely forgotten the mechanics of feeling desired by anyone. It was during one of those late, lonely nights in my freezing apartment that I first saw the images of white sand, turquoise water, and smiles that seemed to glow with a warmth I hadn't felt in decades. I started browsing forums and watching videos of men just like me who had traded their drab Western lives for a tropical paradise filled with vibrant energy and beautiful, attentive women. It felt like a door had finally opened in the back of my dark waiting room, offering a glimpse of a sun-drenched exit that promised a second chance at youth. I didn't realize then that my desperate search for color would lead me into a storm. I was drowning in a sea of corporate beige when I stumbled upon what felt like a shimmering oasis in the middle of my digital desert. It started with a late-night rabbit hole on YouTube, watching men who looked just like me, tired and overlooked, sipping cocktails on white sand beaches while vibrant women leaned into their shoulders. The contrast between my frozen dinner and those sun-drenched clips of Cebu was almost violent. My modest retirement fund, which barely covered taxes in Ohio, could buy me a life of luxury across the ocean. I felt a surge of hope, a dangerous spark whispering that I didn't have to die in a cubicle. The more I researched, the more the Philippines felt like a logical sanctuary for a man the West had decided to discard. I spent hours watching vloggers who promised a culture of traditional values where age was respected and companionship wasn't a battlefield. They spoke of a place where $1,000 made you a king, and where my lonely existence could be traded for the warmth of a tropical village. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the desperate need to be seen again, to feel like a man with a future. I was convinced I'd finally found the cheat code to a happy ending. I started calculating the math of my new life with the precision of an accountant, mapping out a paradise built on the exchange rate. In my spreadsheets, the Philippines wasn't just a country. It was a financial rescue mission where my pension would be a superpower. I saw myself living in a high-rise condo with a sea view, escaping the crushing weight of Western expectations. The pension test hadn't even crossed my mind yet. I was too busy dreaming of a woman who would look at me with genuine adoration. Everything felt so easy, as if the universe was finally apologizing for the decades I'd wasted in the West. Then I saw her. I had signed up for a dating site specifically for the islands, scrolling through thousands of faces, until I landed on a profile that stopped my heart. Her name was Maria, and she had a smile that radiated a kind of innocence I thought had gone extinct. She was 24, with deep brown eyes that looked like they held the peace I was searching for. In her bio, she wrote about family, God, and her dream of finding a kind-hearted man. I stared at her photo for an hour, convinced that this was divine intervention, meant to save my lonely soul. My hands were shaking as I typed the first message, a simple hello from America that felt like the most important sentence I'd ever written. I knew that once I hit send, there was no going back. I was stepping off the ledge into the unknown. I told myself a man with my experience could handle the risks, that I was too smart to be played. I hit enter, watching the icon flicker with a promise of a new beginning, unaware this was the first step toward my ruin. I waited, staring at the screen, until the little green dot next to her name finally flickered to life. Landing in Cebu was like stepping into a different dimension, where the air was thick with the scent of sea salt and possibilities. Maria was there, standing behind the barricade with a handmade sign that had my name surrounded by glittery hearts. When she saw me, she didn't just wave. She ran through the crowd and threw her arms around my neck, crying as if I were a soldier returning from a long war. I remember the softness of her skin and the way she smelled like coconut oil and jasmine, a scent that instantly erased 30 years of fluorescent lights and stale office coffee. In that moment, I wasn't a 57-year-old retiree with a bad back. I was the most important man in the world, and I fell for it with every fiber of my being. Within the first week, I felt like a version of myself I hadn't seen since my 20s. Maria took me to local markets and high-end malls, picking out linen shirts that made me look like a wealthy traveler instead of a tired tourist. She would walk beside me, her small hand tucked firmly into mine, occasionally leaning her head against my shoulder just to whisper how handsome I looked. I'd catch our reflection in store windows, this vibrant, beautiful young woman and this silver-haired man, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible. I felt like I was finally starring in the life I was always meant to have, basking in a level of adoration that felt more intoxicating than any drug I'd ever tried. Our relationship felt like a perfect movie script, where every scene was more magical than the last, choreographed to perfection by some unseen director. We would wake up in my luxury condo overlooking the ocean, and she would already have coffee waiting, along with a plate of fresh mangoes she had peeled herself. We spent our afternoons lounging by the pool or taking boat trips to hidden lagoons where the water was so clear it didn't even look real. I was living a montage of pure, unadulterated bliss, convinced that I was the lucky one who had finally found the secret exit from a mediocre existence. I was so busy acting out my part as the romantic lead that I never stopped to ask who had written the dialogue we were speaking. The level of care she provided was something I had never experienced in the West, a kind of total devotion that felt almost spiritual in its intensity. If I had a slight headache, she would massage my temples for an hour with cooling oils. If I looked even slightly tired, she would insist I nap while she fanned me. It was a retirement plan with a pulse, a living, breathing cushion against the harsh realities of the world. She made me feel like my every thought was fascinating, and my every comfort was her ultimate priority. I started to believe that this was what true love actually looked like, a selfless surrender that made my previous marriage feel like a cold, transactional business arrangement by comparison. For our 1-month anniversary, I flew us to a private island resort in El Nido that cost more per night than my monthly mortgage back in Ohio. We sat on a candlelit beach under a canopy of stars that looked like spilled diamonds, drinking expensive wine while a local musician played soft love songs on a guitar nearby. Maria looked across the table at me, her eyes shimmering with what I was certain were tears of gratitude and love, and told me she couldn't believe a man like me existed. I felt a surge of protective pride, a desire to give her the entire world just to keep that look on her face forever. I was convinced that my money was just a tool to facilitate our love, not the foundation it was built upon. Then came the trip to her province, a humble village where the houses were made of bamboo and the roads were mostly dirt and hope. I arrived like a visiting deity, greeted by dozens of her relatives who treated me with a level of respect that bordered on worship. Her mother hugged me and called me son, while her younger siblings looked at me with wide, awe-filled eyes as I handed out small gifts and candies. I felt like a savior, a benevolent king who had descended from the heavens to lift this family out of poverty. It was the ultimate ego trip, an intoxicating validation of my worth that made me feel more powerful and needed than I ever had in my 3 decades of corporate service. Spending money during that time didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a joyful investment in our shared future and her family's happiness. When her brother needed a new motorbike for work, I didn't hesitate to pull out my thick wad of pesos and make it happen, relishing the way Maria beamed with pride. When her grandmother needed maintenance medicine, I paid the pharmacy bill for 6 months in advance without even checking the total. I was the foreign CEO of her world, and the dividends were paid in kisses, whispers of mahal kita, and a house that was always filled with laughter. I thought I was buying memories and loyalty, never realizing I was simply funding a production that required a very specific budget to stay in theaters. My second youth was in full bloom, and I started to ignore the mirror and the math, focusing only on the way she made me feel when the lights were low. I began to tell myself that age was just a number, and that our souls were somehow matched in a way that defied logic or culture. I convinced myself that Maria saw the real me, the man buried under the layers of corporate burnout and middle-age spread, and that she genuinely preferred my wisdom over the energy of a younger man. I was living in a beautiful, sun-drenched delusion, where my pension was a secondary detail to my inherent charm. I had successfully lied to myself so thoroughly that I started to believe my own press releases about our destined romance. She became my emotional shield, standing between me and the crushing loneliness that had defined my life back in the States. Whenever a flicker of doubt entered my mind, or a friend from home sent a skeptical email, I would just look at Maria's smiling face and dismiss them as cynical and bitter. I was protected by a wall of tropical heat and youthful affection, a barrier that kept the cold reality of my situation at a comfortable distance. I felt like I had finally won the game of life, beating the system that told men like me to just grow old quietly and disappear. I was the exception to every rule. The one man who had actually found the diamond in the rough among the millions of faces. I didn't realize that in this perfect movie script, I was merely a guest star with a very expensive contract, not the director or the producer I imagined myself to be. Every touch, every laugh, and every thoughtful gesture was a line of dialogue, carefully rehearsed to keep the production running smoothly. I was so caught up in the performance that I failed to see the stagehands, her family, waiting in the wings for their cues and their paychecks. I thought we were building a home, but we were actually just building a set, a beautiful facade that was only meant to stand as long as the funding remained secure. I was the only person on that set who didn't realize the cameras weren't actually recording a documentary of true love. By the third month, we were already talking about the K-1 visa and our wedding, planning a life in the States that would be just as magical as our time in Cebu. I started looking at engagement rings that cost the equivalent of a year's salary for a local worker, wanting to mark her as mine with the biggest stone I could afford. Everything felt so certain, so solid, as if the universe itself was conspiring to give me this one last chance at happiness before the clock ran out. I was floating on a cloud of dopamine and tropical air, completely untethered from the financial reality of what it would cost to transplant her entire life into mine. I was ready to bet everything on a woman I had known for 90 days. I was the happiest man in the world, standing on the balcony of our condo as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. Maria was behind me, her arms wrapped around my waist, whispering about how she couldn't wait to be my wife and how she would never, ever leave my side. I felt a sense of peace so profound it almost brought me to tears, believing that the pension test I had planned was just a formality to prove what I already knew in my heart. Looking back, I should have realized that a script this perfect, a role this flawless, was always too good to be true. But I was so desperate for the dream that I refused to see the cracks in the stage. The first crack in my tropical paradise didn't arrive with a thunderclap. It was a soft, whispered request for load on her phone so she could call her mother. It was only a few dollars, a rounding error in my daily budget, and I handed it over with a smile, feeling like a generous provider. I told myself it was natural for a young woman to want to stay connected to her family, and my ability to facilitate that felt like a badge of honor. My savings were a massive, silent reservoir of water, and this was just a microscopic pinprick in the concrete dam. It was so small that I barely noticed the first drop of moisture hitting the dry earth at my feet, convinced that my wealth was essentially infinite in this part of the world. A week later, the pinprick widened when Maria's mother suddenly developed a severe fever that required immediate private clinic intervention and expensive antibiotics. Maria cried against my chest, her body trembling with a vulnerability that made my protective instincts surge like a tidal wave of misplaced chivalry. I didn't just pay the bill. I sent extra for nutritious food to aid the recovery, rationalizing that being a good son-in-law meant stepping up during a family crisis. I viewed it as an investment in our shared future, a way to cement my status as the benevolent patriarch they desperately needed. I ignored the fact that the water level in my reservoir had dropped an inch, telling myself that true love doesn't keep a ledger. The requests began to gain a rhythmic, almost musical quality, shifting from medical emergencies to essential upgrades for her younger brother's aging motorbike. Maria explained that without a working bike, he couldn't transport his harvest to the market, which meant the entire family would suffer throughout the upcoming rainy season. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, but then I calculated the cost and realized it was less than I'd spend on a single weekend back in Ohio. It felt like a strategic move. If the brother was self-sufficient, he wouldn't need my help later, right? I was teaching a man to fish with my wallet, slapping a piece of duct tape over the growing leak in my dam and calling it a permanent repair. By the second month, the small fissures were starting to whistle as the pressure of the family's expectations began to mount behind the scenes. Maria mentioned that their ancestral home in the province had a roof that leaked so badly they had to sleep under plastic sheets whenever it rained. The image of her beautiful, innocent sisters shivering in the dark was more than my ego could handle, so I authorized the purchase of high-quality corrugated metal and local labor. I told myself I was building a legacy, a physical manifestation of my love that would stand long after I was gone. I was the foreign CEO of their survival, and I relished the power that came with every wire transfer, even as the spray from the leaking dam started to dampen my linen shirts. I started to notice a subtle shift in the atmosphere whenever I questioned a price or asked for a receipt. A shadow would cross Maria's face, followed by a period of tampo, that heavy, suffocating silence. She wouldn't be angry, just hurt that I didn't trust her, which inevitably led to me apologizing and doubling the amount just to see her smile return. I rationalized this emotional tax as a cultural nuance, a delicate dance of pride and poverty that a sophisticated Western man like me should be able to navigate. I was paying for the peace in my home, buying back the affection that had felt so free just weeks before. The reservoir was still deep, but the constant, low-level drainage was starting to create a permanent whirlpool in my thoughts. Then came the business opportunity, a proposal for a sari-sari store that would supposedly give her mother a steady income and get the family off my payroll for good. It was a classic pitch, delivered with spreadsheets drawn on napkins and promises of local sustainability that appealed to my logical, corporate-trained mind. I saw it as a severance package for her family's dependents, a way to buy my way back to the simple, one-on-one romance I had originally envisioned. I ignored the voice in my head that whispered about the high failure rate of such ventures, choosing instead to believe in the miracle of entrepreneurship in the Visayas. I was diverting a whole channel of my reservoir now, convincing myself it was for irrigation rather than a slow-motion flood. Social pressure began to seep into our relationship through the village's upcoming fiesta, where I was expected to be the primary sponsor for the community feast and the beauty pageant. Maria explained that if I didn't contribute significantly, her family would lose face, a concept that felt more threatening than any financial loss in this culture. I found myself writing checks for lechon and pageant gowns, feeling a strange mix of resentment and intoxicating pride as the entire village toasted to my health. I was maintaining the facade of the wealthy American, a role I had grown to love even as it became increasingly expensive to play. The reservoir was looking suspiciously shallow at the edges, the mud starting to show through the clear water I had once taken for granted. Education was the next emergency, with her younger sister's tuition fees suddenly due, and no other way for the girl to avoid being kicked out of school. Maria framed it as a moral obligation, a chance for me to change a young girl's life forever with a sum that wouldn't even cover a new set of tires back home. I felt like a mentor, a benevolent God reaching down to pluck a deserving soul from the cycle of poverty, and I signed the transfer with a flourish of self-importance. I was a savior, and saviors don't worry about the hairline fractures spiderwebbing across the base of their financial foundations. I told myself that once the school year was paid for, the requests would finally stop, and we could go back to the beach. The second medical miracle occurred just 3 weeks later, involving a cousin who had supposedly been in a motorbike accident and needed immediate surgery that the public hospital couldn't provide. By now, the groaning of the concrete dam was becoming audible in the quiet moments of the night, a deep structural vibration that I tried to drown out with more expensive wine. I started to feel like the only person in a room full of people who had any resources at all, which made saying no feel like a death sentence I was passing on a stranger. I was trapped in a cycle of heroism, paying for surgeries I never saw and medicine I never touched, all to keep the Disney filter from cracking. I tried to add up the total spend in my head one night while Maria slept, but the number was so jarring that I quickly pushed it aside, choosing to focus on the low cost of living instead. I rationalized that even with the family support, I was still spending less than I would have on a high-end retirement home in Florida, so I was technically still winning. This was the substitution pivot in action. I was substituting my common sense for a series of convenient lies that allowed me to keep playing the role of the lucky expat. I ignored the spray of cold water hitting my face, telling myself it was just a refreshing mist from the fountain of youth I had discovered. The affection Maria gave me started to feel more like a reward for a successful transaction than a spontaneous overflow of her heart, though I fought that realization with everything I had. Whenever a large sum was transferred, she was the most attentive, loving woman on earth. But when I slowed the pace, she became stressed and tired, her smiles becoming forced and brittle. I told myself she was just burdened by her family's problems, and that my money was the only thing that could relieve her depression. I was using my pension to buy the oxygen she needed to breathe, never realizing that I was the one who was actually suffocating. The water was pouring out of the bottom of the dam now, carving a deep, irreversible path in the dirt. Suspicions were no longer just whispers in the back of my mind. They were becoming a deafening roar that I could no longer ignore, despite my best efforts to stay in character. I looked at the beautiful woman beside me and wondered if she saw a man or a pension with a pulse, a realization that felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I needed to know the truth, not the scripted version of love we had been performing for the last 6 months, but a raw, unfiltered look at her loyalty. I decided to stop being the foreign CEO and start being the audit, creating a scenario that would finally reveal the foundation of our life together. I was about to tell her the biggest, most dangerous lie of my life, a test that would either prove my fears wrong or destroy everything I had built. By the 6th month, the conversation shifted from small medical bills to our forever foundation. The moment Maria presented the dream that would eventually seal my fate. She sat me down with a map of a coastal plot in her province, her eyes wet with a shimmering vision of a white house where we'd grow old together. She called it our sanctuary of trust, a place where her family could finally feel secure under my protection, far away from the rental market's uncertainty. It wasn't just a house. It was a physical manifestation of my commitment, the final proof that I wasn't just a guest in her life. I felt a surge of feverish pride, believing that this was the logical conclusion of my journey. But as she spoke about the blueprints, a cold shiver of anxiety began to crawl up my spine. The catch, of course, was the legal reality that as a foreigner, I couldn't own the land, so the title would have to be in her name alone for the transaction to proceed. I remember staring at the paperwork, my corporate-trained brain screaming about asset protection and risk mitigation, while my lonely heart shouted even louder about the beauty of unconditional love. Maria sensed my hesitation and used it as a stage for a masterful performance of tampo, suggesting that if I didn't trust her with the land, perhaps I didn't truly trust her with my life. I was caught in a trap of my own making, desperate to prove I was the foreign CEO who didn't let numbers dictate his happiness. Little did I know, the price of this proof was escalating by the minute. I spent 3 nights staring at my retirement portal, watching the numbers that represented 30 years of fluorescent-lit misery and sacrificed weekends. To build this dream, I would have to liquidate nearly 80% of my remaining liquid assets, moving the money from the safety of my U.S. brokerage into a local bank account. It felt like standing at the edge of a jagged cliff, looking down at a fog-shrouded valley, and convincing myself that if I just jumped, the sheer power of our love would make wings sprout from my back. I called it a leap of faith. But in reality, it was a blind plunge into a void where the floor was made of empty promises. I was terrified, yet strangely addicted to the rush of being her savior. The urgency became a physical weight when Maria's mother informed us that another interested buyer, a rich businessman from Manila, was ready to swoop in if we didn't provide the payment by Friday. The family board of directors was in full session, with aunts and cousins dropping by our condo to talk about the blessing I was bringing to their bloodline. I felt like I was in the middle of a high-stakes corporate merger where the only due diligence allowed was a kiss and a smile. The pressure was intoxicating, a whirlwind of social validation that made me feel like the most powerful man in the Visayas. I was so busy enjoying the applause that I didn't hear the sound of the trap snapping shut. I convinced myself that this was the final hurdle, the big boss level of the romance game that, once defeated, would finally grant me eternal peace and devotion. I imagined us sitting on that porch, the pension test far behind us, watching the sunset over the Mindanao Sea, without a single financial worry left in the world. I was investing in a Disney filter life, buying a script where I was the hero who saved the beautiful maiden from a cycle of poverty. It felt like I was finally in control of my destiny, using my wealth to curate a reality that the cold, gray West could never offer me. I was ready to bet my entire existence on a girl who still didn't know how to pronounce my last name. I sat in the cold, air-conditioned silence of the bank branch in Cebu, the smell of crisp bills and ink filling the room as the teller waited for my final authorization. Maria sat next to me, her hand squeezing mine so tightly I could feel her pulse racing in sync with my own. With a trembling hand, I signed the wire transfer for $85,000, the lion's share of my life's work, and watched the screen flicker as the successful notification appeared in bright green letters. I felt a momentary sense of relief, a heavy burden lifted, unaware that I had just signed the warrant for my own destruction. Because as we walked out into the humid afternoon air, Maria's phone buzzed with a message that wasn't from her mother. We walked out of that bank into the blinding Cebu sun, and I felt a weightless euphoria, convinced I had finally anchored my soul to this island forever. I looked at Maria, and in my mind, she was no longer just a woman I was dating. She was the sacred vault where I had deposited my entire future, my 30 years of sweat and cubicle-induced misery. I squeezed her hand, feeling the gold band I'd bought her, and for a fleeting 30 seconds, I was the undisputed king of my own private universe. I didn't see the way her eyes kept darting to her purse, nor did I hear the low, rhythmic thrum of the trap finally closing around my neck. We stopped for a celebratory lunch at a high-end restaurant overlooking the water, the kind of place where a single meal costs a local's weekly wage. Maria excused herself to the restroom, leaving her phone face down on the white linen tablecloth, vibrating with a persistence that felt aggressive and intrusive. I shouldn't have looked. I should have kept staring at the waves, but a notification flashed on the screen. A name I didn't recognize, June, followed by a series of heart emojis and a message in Tagalog I couldn't fully parse. The air in the room suddenly felt thin, like I was standing on a mountain peak where oxygen was a luxury I could no longer afford. I picked up the phone, my fingers trembling so violently I almost dropped it into my expensive wine, and used the birthday code she'd once shown me in a moment of transparency. The screen bloomed into a digital graveyard of my dignity, revealing a series of photos from the night before, while I was supposedly resting from the heat. There was Maria, my sweet, innocent Maria, laughing in a crowded karaoke bar, draped over a muscular Filipino man half my age, holding a glass of the very scotch I had purchased for her family. The timestamp was 2 hours after she'd kissed me goodnight, claiming she needed to pray for our future home. When she returned to the table, her face didn't hold the Disney filter anymore. She saw me holding the phone, and her expression flattened into something cold, professional, and terrifyingly efficient. There was no crying, no tampo, no desperate pleas for forgiveness. She simply sat down, crossed her arms, and looked at me with the detached boredom of an accountant closing a finished ledger. The woman who had whispered "Mahal kita" an hour ago was gone, replaced by a stranger who looked through me as if I were a piece of furniture that had outlived its usefulness. I tried to speak, but my voice was a broken rasp. "The transfer is complete, Charles," she said, her voice devoid of the melodic lilt she used when asking for load or medicine. She told me that June was her actual husband, the father of the children I thought were her nieces, and that my $85,000 was already being moved to a joint account I would never touch. I realized then that I wasn't a fiancé or a lover. I was a retirement fund for a family I had never truly known, a successful business venture that had reached its logical conclusion. The family board of directors had already voted, and I was the redundant employee being escorted from the building. I stood up, the room spinning in a nauseating kaleidoscope of white linen and blue sea, watching as she calmly tucked the phone into her designer bag and walked toward the exit without looking back. I saw Junjun waiting for her in the parking lot, sitting on the very motorbike I had invested in, his arms wrapping around her waist with a familiarity that made my stomach turn. He revved the engine, a mocking roar that echoed off the expensive restaurant walls, and she leaned back against him, laughing at something he whispered in her ear. As they sped away, the last thing I saw was the active now green dot on her profile. I stood in that parking lot for an hour, watching the dust settle, before taking a taxi back to the construction site of our forever home. I found the gates locked and my suitcases sitting in the mud, soaked by a sudden, mocking tropical downpour. The legal reality I had ignored slammed into me. The land title was in her name, and I was now a trespasser on property I bought with my life's blood. Her brother stood at the entrance, no longer the grateful recipient of a motorbike, but a cold sentinel, holding a piece of heavy rebar. He didn't speak, he just pointed toward the road. The village that once treated me like a visiting deity now looked at me with mockery and cold indifference. As I dragged my bags toward the main road, children I had fed with candies laughed while their parents whispered about the stupid old foreigner who thought he could buy a heart. I was a shipwreck survivor, crawling onto a jagged shore, watching the people I called family feast on the wreckage of my 30-year career. The family board of directors had executed their exit strategy with surgical precision, leaving me with nothing but the clothes on my back and the crushing weight of my own misplaced ego. I spent my final nights in a windowless hostel room, smelling of mildew and regret, clutching my passport like a holy relic. My bank app showed a balance that looked more like a temperature than a retirement fund, just enough for a one-way ticket back to a country that no longer felt like home. I sat in the dark, listening to the humid night, realizing I had traded my entire life for a few months of scripted affection and a Disney filter that had finally dissolved. I was a man who tried to play God with a pension and ended up a beggar in a paradise. The airport in Cebu was a mirror of my arrival, but the reflection was distorted and gray. Instead of Maria waiting with glittery hearts and jasmine-scented kisses, there was only the cold, sterile hum of the terminal and the judgmental stares of other travelers. I stood in the same spot where I had once felt like the luckiest man alive, now just a ghost in a cheap linen shirt, shivering in the air conditioning. I was the survivor of a self-inflicted disaster, looking back at islands that swallowed my youth and wealth, realizing the paradise I found was just a beautifully decorated slaughterhouse for lonely men. If you're thinking about retiring to the Philippines because you're lonely, look at my face and remember this story. You aren't finding a soulmate who transcends culture. You are signing an employment contract where you are the employer and the family is the union. The moment you run the pension test and the cash stops flowing, the contract is void and you will be discarded like a used battery. Don't be the Joe who loses everything trying to buy a second youth. Learn from my ruin. A retirement plan with a pulse is just a predator waiting for your bank account to hit zero. If you're sitting there in your living room, scrolling through photos of beautiful women in Cebu or Davao and thinking you've finally found a shortcut to happiness, let me ask you something. Are you truly ready to be a payroll instead of a person? You think you're being clever by running a pension test to see if she loves the man or the money. But in the Philippines, that's not a romantic gesture. It's a breach of contract. To her and her family board of directors, you aren't a soulmate. You are a strategic investment for their collective survival. When the ATM stops spitting out those blue bills, the I love yous don't just fade. They turn into a calculated search for your replacement before the sun even sets on your empty bank account. Don't be the Joe who thinks he's special enough to transcend the cold, hard economic reality of the islands. Take it from a man who is currently a lighthouse built on the jagged rocks of his own shipwreck. There are rules to this game that you ignore at your own peril. Rule number 1 is that the family board of directors always has the final veto. You are marrying a corporation, not just a girl. When the dividends stop, the board orders a total liquidation of the asset, which is you. Rule number 2 is the substitution pivot. The moment you claim you're broke, that green Active Now dot on her dating profile will flicker back to life as she sends out resumes to the next foreign CEO. And finally, remember the medical emergency miracle cure. The second you cut the funding, her father's terminal illness will miraculously vanish because there's no more juice left in the lemon. This isn't betrayal. It's a standard exit strategy for a business venture that has gone into default. I'm back in the States now, living in a basement apartment that smells like damp cardboard, watching the snow fall and remembering the heat of a sun that burned me to the bone. If you're planning your dream retirement, I'm the ghost from your future telling you to turn the ship around before you hit the reef. Never send an exit fee or a severance package to a woman who already has her next sponsor lined up on the motorbike you paid for. Block the numbers, delete the apps, and keep your pension in a bank that doesn't require a translator to navigate. I thought I was buying a second youth, but I was actually just paying for the privilege of being destroyed by a script I didn't write. Don't let your desire for a Disney filter romance blind you to the fact that in this paradise, you are the only one who doesn't know the game is already over.